The fire is already lit. Sit down, breathe, and listen. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are. Carl Jung. That night, there were no more questions. Only an ancient weariness. Not of the body, but of carrying a script that was never his. He couldn't explain it. He could only feel it, as if something in his life didn't begin with him, but weighed on him as if it did. It wasn't drama. It was a calling, silent yet constant, as if a pact had been made before his own story began. And in that moment, before the fire, he finally heard what had always been there. You didn't come here to repeat. You came to end. This video is a rite of remembrance, not about guilt, but about courage. The courage to feel what many have ignored, to see what no one dared to look at, to become the turning point in a story that has repeated for generations. You'll understand why certain pains pierce you, even without a clear origin, how ancestral cycles shape your story without you realizing, and why the feeling of not belonging might actually be the greatest sign of awakening. But first, a warning. This video is not a quick fix. It's a mirror, and it may be uncomfortable, but necessary. Because some truths don't set you free gently, they set you free with clarity. And are you ready to discover what your soul already knows, but the world taught you to forget? Then stay. The fire still has much to reveal. He didn't know where it came from, but he felt it. In his body, in his breath, in the silences. A sorrow that had no explanation, a longing for something he had never lived. It wasn't memory, it was inheritance, and yet it hurt as if it were his own, an invisible weight that followed him through the days, tightening his chest without warning. Carl Jung said that the unconscious doesn't begin with us. It is woven from threads that came long before, threads made of unwept pain, of silent pacts, of stories left unfinished, waiting for someone to bring them to an end. He felt that, even without understanding it. He felt it when entering certain houses, when hearing certain songs, when looking at photos of people he had never even met. And in that feeling, a suspicion began to form. What if what's paralyzing me isn't even mine? For a long time, he tried to rationalize, told himself, it's just in my head. But his body wasn't convinced, because the body always knows. There was a pain no one named, yet it lived in every gesture of the family, in the silence at the table, in the eyes that looked away, in the patterns hiding behind the word tradition. And even without living those stories, he carried the effects, as if he had been chosen not to continue, but to feel what no one before had the strength to feel. Jung wrote, "The soul of a family seeks in each generation someone conscious enough to face what was denied. And when that soul finds you, it's not a punishment, it's an invitation, not to suffer, but to set free. Because to feel is the beginning of liberation, and you, even without knowing how, are the first one listening." He was there, in the same place as always, in the childhood home, among familiar voices, repeated gestures, old jokes. Nothing had changed, yet everything inside him no longer fit. No one seemed to notice. The conversation flowed, The affection was the same, but something in his chest tightened, as if the air there was too dense to breathe freely. It was like watching a play where everyone knew their lines, except him.
He tried to smile, tried to join in, but inside, something screamed without sound. This isn't mine anymore. It wasn't judgment, it was lucidity. The same lucidity that awakens when love demands silence, when loyalty demands sacrifice, when being accepted costs your own soul. He wrote that the individual who awakens to themselves inevitably feels estranged from the tribe. Because once you see what lies beneath the inherited roles, you can no longer pretend you didn't see it. He wasn't better, wasn't superior, but he was the only one who had stopped repeating on autopilot. And that, as subtle as it was, changed everything. The pain wasn't theirs, it was his. The pain of seeing everything the same, and knowing that if he stayed as he was, he'd be betraying himself. It was strange, because he loved them, loved the tender way they cared for things, loved the memories, but he could no longer love the structure that kept him small. And that hurt. Because there is a silent pain in realizing that to be whole, you might have to disappoint. That's when he understood. To love is not to repeat. It is to dare to heal what everyone else learned to hide. And he saw it, saw the resentment no one spoke of, the fear disguised as caution, the guilt served on the lunch plate, seasoned with the phrase, "It's just how he is." Jung wrote, "He who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens." And there at that table, he was awakening, not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity sometimes separates before it unites. There was no way to go back to the old role, because now he knew to belong to the family without belonging to himself was not love, it was self-abandonment. He didn't want to repeat, but without realizing, he already was. In his gestures, in his reactions, in the automatic choices he inherited, like someone inherits a last name. He said, "I'm different." But when silence fell, he saw himself acting the same, walking the same paths as those before him, loving the same way, swallowing the same anger, trading his presence for acceptance. It was like being trapped in a dance that started before he was even born, an invisible choreography, but precise. He tried to change, did everything he was taught. He meditated, studied, made goal lists, went through healing cycles, therapy, but something still held him back. And that prison was subtle, not physical. It was psychic. It was ancestral. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And that's what he began to suspect. Maybe that life wasn't wrong. It simply wasn't his. He was tired. But it wasn't a physical fatigue. It was soul tired. Tired of carrying pain that wasn't his. of trying to fix stories that were never even told. And it was at that point of exhaustion that lucidity took over. I don't need to continue this. He didn't need to carry silent packs, nor uphold the role of the one who endures everything, nor repeat survival agreements that the elders had called love. And that realization didn't come gently. It came through pain. Because when you stop repeating, you separate, not from people, but from the version of yourself you had to become to survive among them. Jung wrote, "True transformation does not come from force. It comes from the moment you stop running from what you feel." That's when he stopped. Not out of weakness, but out of presence. He stopped running, stopped proving, stopped trying to be the enlightened version of himself.
And in that dense silence, he realized the repetition was over. Now begins what is real. He thought it was his choice to walk away, to heal, to set boundaries. But little by little, something deeper began to emerge. That choice wasn't his alone. Each time he said no to a repetition, it wasn't just his own life that shifted. There was something else, invisible yet real, that seemed to move far behind him, back in the origins. It was as if each conscious step unraveled knots that had been tied for decades. As if what he did here, in the present, also touched a past that had never been allowed to change. Jung said, "The soul of a family seeks, in every generation, someone awake enough to interrupt the cycle." And then he understood. He wasn't being punished for feeling too much. He was being chosen to end it. Each time he took a deep breath instead of reacting, each time he chose truth over performance, each time he said, "This stops with me," something in his lineage breathed with him. As if for the first time, someone was truly doing it differently, with love, not with guilt. After that, the impulse came with force. It wasn't anger, nor haste. It was a calm, yet firm desire to cleanse. He started with his surroundings, books that no longer made sense, clothes from versions of himself that no longer existed, objects carrying memories that no longer needed space. But soon he realized it wasn't about what was outside, it was about what was inside. What he was clearing was symbolic. He was telling the universe, "I am no longer the version that carries everything without filtering." Jung taught that the path of individuation goes through the confrontation with what was repressed and the release of what is no longer essential. And to cleanse was that, not a rejection, but a return, a silent way to give back to the right places what no longer needed to live in his soul. He began to say no without guilt, to remain silent without having to explain, to step away without apologizing. Each small release was a small ritual, not of escape, but of reverence, as if to say, "I honor this, but I don't need to carry it anymore." And in that new space, something began to breathe. By now, He had let go of so much. The masks, the roles, the bonds that demanded his presence but denied his essence. But what impressed him the most was that even after everything, his heart was still open, not untouched, but available. He hadn't hardened, and that, in a world like this, is a subtle kind of miracle. Carl Jung said that the soul doesn't grow through protection, but through felt truth. And he had felt deeply. He felt it when hugs turned cold. He felt it when "I'm fine" hid absence. He felt it when he was accused of being too sensitive, simply because he couldn't fake it anymore. But he knew pretending would be easier. Closing off would be safer, but it would betray something essential within him. And that's when he decided sensitivity wouldn't be a weakness, it would be his portal. Because keeping the heart open after it has been wounded is one of the deepest forms of strength that exists.
That night, he no longer cried. Not because it was over, but because he had made it through. There was something different in his breath. It wasn't the peace of someone who had won. It was the presence of someone who had stopped running. He felt his body more whole, his soul quieter, his mind no longer in a rush. Jung wrote that individuation is the process of becoming who you are, not as an ideal, but as integration. And that was it. He didn't become someone new. He simply stopped denying himself. He no longer sought answers, nor validation, nor saviors. His strength now came from the simple things, being with what is, with what he feels, with what still remains. And that simplicity dismantled every system that demanded performance. Now he understood. To be whole is not to be perfect. It is to be true. And maybe that was the deepest kind of freedom. Not just his, but for the entire story that brought him here. That night, he no longer needed to understand anything. Not because he had given up on answers, but because he had discovered something deeper than explanation. Silence also answers. Sitting before the fire, with no effort, no script, he simply stayed. There was no more urgency, no more need to prove himself, no more fear of being seen in pieces. Now there was space. Space for the soul to breathe, slowly. Jung never promised miracles. He spoke of processes, of cycles, of fertile chaos. He said that every lush tree was once a forgotten seed in the darkness. And maybe that was what was happening there. It wasn't the end of pain. It was the end of running. And with it, the birth of something unnamed, but already pulsing with clarity. Because sometimes, a cycle doesn't end with an explosion. It ends with a sigh, with the courage to stay where you once ran. Carl Jung taught us that destiny is not what happens to you, it's what repeats unconsciously when you don't awaken. And when someone awakens, even in silence, the world around them changes. Culture tries to convince us that healing is conquest, that growth is accumulation. But Jung pointed somewhere else. He said the real path is individuation, to integrate all that was rejected within us, not to ascend, but to descend into the center of the soul. It is there, at the center, that the seeds live of what no one has ever seen bloom. While the world celebrates what shines, Jung celebrated what survives the night, what walks in darkness with its own eyes, what carries what the whole family avoided, what cries without an audience, what loves without guarantees. And that's why when someone like you awakens, you are not just closing a personal cycle, you are redrawing the invisible field of the collective. Every soul that refuses to repeat teaches others how to remember. Every choice made with presence heals a trace of the unconscious that governs us. And so, without needing to change the world, you change the world. That night, I didn't receive any answers. And maybe that's why everything finally made sense. There was no more urgency, no more impulse to explain myself, no more old need to fit an invisible expectation.
For the first time, I wasn't trying to change my life. I was simply present in it. I didn't need to promise anything or plan the next step. I just stayed there, with myself, with what still hurt, with what had already transformed. And it was there, in that simple place, that I realized nothing outside of me needed to happen for something inside me to finally begin. Since then, every time doubt returns, or when the world demands versions that no longer represent me, I don't run, I return to the fire. If something inside you calmed during this vigil, it's not because I said anything. It's because, for the first time in a long time, you heard yourself. Maybe this video didn't bring a clear answer, but it pointed to a path, a return, not to the past, but to the center, to what pulses in silence when the noise fades. Carl Jung once wrote, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." If that awakening began today, honor it, not with haste, but with pause, with silence, with reverence. That night, I understood everything, and ever since, whenever the world feels heavy, I return to the fire. See you soon.